There is a particular kind of quiet that belongs only to old stone buildings, a quiet that is not merely the absence of sound, but something more like the presence of stillness itself, as though the walls have spent so many centuries absorbing the murmur of voices and the soft tread of footsteps and the long, unhurried breathing of sleeping rooms that they have become, in some gentle way, full of it, saturated with calm, the way cloth becomes saturated with the scent of lavender when it has been stored for a long time in a drawer lined with dried flowers. That is the quiet you find here in this castle on this particular evening, when the rain has just begun to fall somewhere beyond the hills, and the fire in the sitting room has been burning low and steady for the better part of an hour, and there is no one awake in the world, it seems, but you. You arrived sometime in the afternoon, when the light was still pale, and even across the highlands, washing the hills in a kind of soft gray gold that made everything look as though it belonged to a painting made long ago by someone who loved this landscape very much. The drive up had been long and quiet, the road winding through stands of dark pine and over small stone bridges, past the occasional farmhouse with smoke already drifting from its chimney, and by the time the castle came into view, you felt already as though you were moving through a place that existed slightly outside of ordinary time. The stone of the castle walls was the color of old pewter, softened in places by patches of lichen and moss, and the windows were narrow and deep set, and the whole of it sat against the hillside with a kind of settled, unhurried permanence of something that had simply always been there and expected, without any urgency, to go on being there for a long time yet. The woman who welcomed you at the door had kind eyes and spoke in a quiet, unhurried way, showing you through the main hall and up a staircase whose banister was worn smooth by generations of hands, and then along a corridor where the floorboards gave a soft, comfortable creak beneath each step, the kind of sound that feels less like a disturbance and more like a building acknowledging your presence, making a small note of it, the way an old friend might nod when you walk into a room. Your room is on the second floor, looking out over the rear garden and the hills beyond, and when you set your bag down and stood at the window for a moment, the hills were still there, patient and unhurried, the way hills always are. You did not do very much after that. That was the point, in a way. You sat for a while in the chair by your window and watched the light shift slowly across the hills as afternoon moved toward evening, the shadows lengthening and the color of everything growing a little deeper, a little warmer at the edges. You read a few pages of a book you had brought with you, a book you had been meaning to read for a long time, and though you did not retain much of what you read, you found the experience of reading it, the simple act of letting your eyes move across the lines and your mind follow along at its own pace, deeply pleasant in the way that slow, purposeless things often are. At some point you set the book down on the small table beside the chair and simply sat, your hands resting in your lap, watching the window. When the light had faded, enough that reading would have required the lamp, you got up and washed your face in the basin in the small bathroom, and the water was cool and soft in the way that water in old buildings sometimes is, and you dried your hands on a thick white towel that smelled faintly of something clean and herbal. Then you put on the heavy wool cardigan you had packed specifically for this kind of evening, the one with the deep pockets and the collar that folds up around your neck if you wanted to, and you went downstairs. You found the sitting room almost by instinct, following a warmth in the air and the very faint smell of wood smoke down the corridor and around a corner and through a door that stood slightly open, as though it had been left that way on purpose. The fire was already burning, as it had been described to you, low and even and very calm. The logs settled into a bed of glowing amber coals that pulsed gently with each small movement of air in the room. There were candles on the mantelpiece, 3 of them, thick and cream-colored, burning without any flicker at all in the still air, their flames standing straight and steady, casting a warm light that reached only part way up the walls before fading into the upper shadows where the ceiling disappeared into a comfortable dimness. You stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the room. There was a bookshelf along one wall, full of old books whose spines had faded to soft shades of brown and burgundy and gray. There was a small writing desk in the corner, its surface bare except for a glass paperweight that caught the candlelight and held it. There were 2 deep armchairs near the fire, and between them a low table on which someone had placed a tray with a small pot of something warm and a cup and saucer and a plate with 2 plain biscuits, and the sight of it was so precisely right that you felt something in your chest settle, the way a room settles when the last small thing has been put in its proper place. You crossed the room and sat down in one of the chairs, the one slightly closer to the fire, and drew the wool blanket that was folded over its arm across your lap. The blanket was heavy and soft and smelled faintly of lavender and something else, cedar perhaps, or pine, something that belonged to the hills outside. You poured the tea, if that was what it was, and it poured slowly, and the steam rose in a thin, unhurried column, and the smell of it was warm and faintly herbal, and you wrapped both hands around the cup and held it without drinking, just feeling the warmth of it move through your palms and up into your fingers. Outside the window, the rain had begun. It was not a dramatic rain, not the kind that arrives with wind and noise, but a quiet, steady rain, the kind that seems to have been falling for a long time already, and expects to go on falling for a long time yet. You could hear it against the glass, a soft, continuous sound, neither loud nor entirely soft, simply there, the way the fire was there, the way the candles were there, each of them doing their small thing without interruption or variation. The hills were invisible now beyond the rain and the darkness, but you knew they were there, and that knowledge was its own kind of comfort, the same kind of comfort that comes from knowing that the things you cannot see in the dark are still quietly in their places. The fire shifted once, very slightly, and a small shower of sparks moved upward and disappeared, and then it was still again. You listened to it breathe. There is a sound that fires make when they are burning slowly and well, a soft intermittent sound somewhere between a breath and a sigh, and it is one of the most ancient sounds in human experience, one that carries in it something of every fire that has ever been lit in a room like this, every evening that has ever been spent in this particular way, with rain outside and warmth inside, and the day sliding slowly, without any hurry, into night. You drank a little of your tea. It tasted of chamomile and honey, and something you could not quite name, something mild and pleasant. The cup was slightly thick at the rim, the old-fashioned kind, and the saucer made a soft sound when you set the cup back in it, a small, satisfying sound. You sat for a while without moving, your hands back around the cup, your eyes moving slowly between the fire and the window and back again. Not thinking very much, not needing to, simply present in the room and the warmth and the sound of the rain. There's a particular quality to this kind of evening, a quality you do not often find in ordinary life. That comes from the combination of stillness and warmth and the sound of weather outside a safe and enclosed space. It is not quite the same as contentment, though it contains contentment. It is not quite the same as peace, though peace is very much a part of it. It is closer to something like suspension, like the feeling of being held very gently in a moment that has no particular beginning and no particular end. That simply is, and that asks nothing of you except your quiet presence within it. The candles had burned down perhaps half a centimeter since you came in, which told you that you had been sitting here for some time without noticing it. Time in rooms like this tends to move differently than it does in other places. It does not slow exactly because it does not feel slow. It simply becomes less insistent, less pointed. It spreads out and fills the room the way warmth fills a room, evenly and without urgency, until you stop thinking about it altogether. You shifted slightly in the chair, adjusting the blanket across your legs, and the chair made a small sound beneath you, a comfortable, familiar sound. The sound of old furniture accommodating a body in the way it has accommodated many bodies over many years. The cushion was firm enough to support you and soft enough to be pleasant, and you found yourself settling into it a little more deeply, your spine lengthening slightly and then relaxing, your shoulders dropping just a fraction. The rain outside was still falling at exactly the same pace it had been falling when you first noticed it. There was something reassuring in this, in the constancy of it. Rain in the highlands does not perform. It does not build toward anything or resolve itself dramatically. It simply falls, as it has fallen for all of remembered time, onto the hills and the stone and the dark surface of the loch you had noticed as you drove in, lying flat and gray between the hills, and the sound of it against the windows of this room was the same as the sound of it against the windows of every room this castle had ever contained, each of them hearing the same rain, the same patient and unhurried sound. You thought briefly and without any urgency about the drive up, and about the hills you had passed through, and about the way the light had been. You thought about the road and the way it had wound, and the farmhouse with the smoke, and the small stone bridges over the dark water. These thoughts moved through you slowly and without weight, the way reflections move across still water, touching the surface and then dissolving back into it without leaving any trace. The fire made it sound again, that low and breathing sound, and one of the logs shifted very slightly in the grate, and there was a soft hiss of settling, and then quiet again. The coals beneath the logs had deepened in color, moving from orange toward a deeper, more settled amber, and the light they gave off was a little dimmer than it had been, a little more even, filling the lower part of the room with a glow that was almost golden, and that made everything it touched look warm and slightly soft, as though the edges of things had been gently blurred. You finished the rest of your tea. The last of it was only just warm and slightly more concentrated than the earlier sips, with more of the honey taste and less of the herbal, and it was pleasant in its own way, the way the end of a cup of tea always has its own particular quality, different from the beginning or the middle, a kind of completion without conclusion. You set the cup down on the saucer, and the saucer on the tray, and left your hands folded in your lap. The room was very quiet now in the way rooms become quiet late at night, when the day has finished its work and everything has settled into its natural stillness. You could hear the fire and the rain, and occasionally, very faintly, the sound of wind somewhere high above the castle, moving across the roof or through some narrow passage between the towers, a low, mild sound that came and went without insistence. These were the only sounds. There was no music, no distant television, no traffic, no voice. Only these three sounds layered over each other in a way that was not silence, but was the nearest thing to it that sound could be. You picked up one of the biscuits from the plate and held it for a moment before taking a small bite. It was plain and slightly crumbly, with a faint sweetness and a taste of oats, and it was exactly the right kind of thing to eat in this room on this evening. You ate it slowly, without hurry, and then sat for a while with the taste of it still present and pleasant, and then you set the other biscuit back on the plate and looked at the fire again. The walls of the sitting room were old stone, covered in some places by faded tapestries in muted colors, blue and green and a kind of dusty rose, their patterns worn enough that you could not quite make out what they depicted, only the suggestion of forms, perhaps trees, perhaps figures moving softly in and out of legibility in the candlelight. The stone around the fireplace was darker than the rest, stained over centuries by smoke and heat, and the mantelpiece above it was of dark wood, carved at its edges with a simple pattern that was almost worn smooth. The candles stood on it in small holders, and their reflections moved very faintly in the glass of the paperweight on the writing desk across the room. There was a particular pleasure in simply looking at things in a room like this, in letting your eyes move from one thing to another, without any particular purpose or program, simply noticing the spines of the books, the grain of the wooden floor visible at the edges of the old rug, the way the light from the fire moved differently from the light from the candles, the fire's light flickering very slightly, even when it seemed still, and the candle's light standing steady as a held breath. The color of the blanket across your legs, a deep blue-green that reminded you of the hills seen from a distance through mist. The castle was entirely quiet around you. You knew, in an abstract and comfortable way, that the building extended in all directions around this room, that there were corridors and staircases and other rooms and other doors, but all of that felt distant and irrelevant, as remote as the hills outside, present and unhurried, but belonging to another order of things. Here, in this room, with the fire and the candles and the rain, there was only this, and this was entirely sufficient. You thought about sleep, not with any urgency, not as something you were trying to reach, but simply in the way that sleep becomes present in your thoughts on evenings like this, drifting into awareness the way the smell of rain drifts in under a door, gradual and inevitable, and not unwelcome. Your eyes were perhaps a little heavier than they had been when you first sat down. The chair was very comfortable. The blanket was very warm. The fire was still doing its quiet, patient work. You had not looked at your phone since arriving. There was something very satisfying in this, in the simple fact of not having reached for it, not having felt the need to. The evening had been what it was, and it had required nothing from you and asked nothing of you except your presence in it, and you had given that presence without thinking about it, and it had been enough. It had been more than enough. It had been, In some way you would not have been able to precisely articulate exactly what was needed. The fire settled again, a small movement, a small sound. The rain continued. The candles burned without changing, their flames as steady as they had been when you first came in, though the candles themselves were a little shorter now, a little more melted into themselves, their wax smooth and slightly warm-looking in the low light. You watched one of the flames for a while without blinking, until your eyes began to feel pleasantly heavy, and then you let them close for a moment, just for a moment, and in that moment the sounds of the room seemed to deepen and grow softer and more present all at once, the way sounds do when your eyes are closed and your attention has nowhere else to go. You opened your eyes again, the room was the same, the fire was the same, the rain was the same. Everything was exactly as it had been, patient and unhurried, going about its quiet work. There is something very old and very human about sitting by a fire on a rainy night, something that has not changed in any essential way across all the generations of people who have done this same thing, in rooms very much like this one, listening to the same sounds, feeling the same warmth, looking at the same shifting light. You were part of that long, unbroken line of evenings, this particular evening another, in a sequence that stretched back further than you could imagine, each one separate and complete, each one made of the same simple elements, warmth and shelter and the sound of weather and the comfort of enclosed space. There was something in this thought that was not quite comfort, and not quite all, but something in between, something quiet and large and deeply reassuring. The logs in the fire had burned down considerably since you came in. The larger one on the right was now reduced to something smaller, its surface cracked and glowing along the cracks, and it would need to be replaced soon, though not yet, not quite yet. For now it was still giving off its heat and its low, even light, and the coals beneath it were deep and steady and warm, and the room was still very warm, still very comfortable, still entirely sufficient. You shifted the blanket a little higher, tucking it more securely across your lap and against your side, and the movement was small and unhurried, and you settled back into the chair afterward with a sense of everything being as it should be, yourself included, your body and the chair and the blanket all in their proper relation to one another, everything fitted together in the quiet and comfortable way of things that have found their place. The wind came again, that faint high sound above the castle, and then it went, and the rain was still there beneath it, and after it, patient and steady, the same as before. You thought about the hills, invisible now in the dark and rain, and about the road you had driven up, and about the loch lying flat between the hills, and all of it was still out there, in the dark, in the rain, existing quietly in its own way, as you existed quietly in yours, and there was something very easy and very good in the thought of all that dark and wet and wind-swept landscape surrounding this small warm room, surrounding the fire and the candles and the blanket and the cup and saucer on the tray, and you holding you all the way around with its vast and quiet presence. You had almost forgotten the second biscuit. You considered it for a moment, looking at it on the plate, then decided not to eat it, simply because you were very comfortable and did not want to move, and because it seemed sufficient to know it was there, that it would be there if you wanted it, that there was nothing urgent or necessary in having it now. This small, inconsequential decision felt like one of the more pleasant ones you had made all day. The candle on the left had a small imperfection in its wick that caused it to burn very slightly differently from the other two, with a barely perceptible additional warmth in its light, a suggestion of a flicker that was not quite a flicker. You had not noticed this before. Now that you noticed it, you found it pleasant. This small individuality, this tiny deviation from the even burning of the others. It made the room feel more particular, more itself, more genuinely inhabited by the specific quality of this specific evening. You let your head rest back against the chair. The chair was tall enough that its back rose well above your head, and resting your head against it felt supported and comfortable. And from this position you could look up at a slight angle and see the ceiling, where the candlelight reached and then faded, the stone ceiling visible for the first few feet above the mantelpiece, and then gradually lost in the deeper dimness higher up. There were shadows up there that were soft and did not move very much, and looking at them was a restful thing to do, like looking at clouds that are moving very slowly. The rain had perhaps grown a little heavier in the last few minutes, or perhaps you had only become more attentive to it, the way you sometimes become more attentive to a sound when you have been sitting still for a long time and there is nothing to distract you from it. It was a fuller sound now, more complex, made up of many individual drops striking the glass at slightly different moments and from slightly different angles, and beneath it you could hear the sound of it on the stones outside, a softer, broader sound, and somewhere further away the sound of it in the gutters and downpipes of the castle, a low continuous murmur that was more felt than heard. You breathed in slowly and breathed out again. The air in the room was warm and faintly scented with wood smoke and candle wax, and something older, something that belonged to the stone itself, a cool mineral undertone that the warmth of the fire only partially displaced. It was a good smell, a smell that felt like it had been here for a long time and was in no hurry to go anywhere. Your hands were very warm in your lap, the warmth of the room and the blanket having accumulated in them over the time you had been sitting here, and you were aware of this warmth as a physical sensation that was pleasant and mild, neither too much nor too little, simply warm in the way that hands in a warm room are warm, contentedly and without drama. The fire made its sound, the rain made its sound. The wind, very faintly, very briefly, made its sound high above, and then went quiet again. The candles went on burning. The room held its warmth and its dimness and its quiet, and you sat in the middle of it all, Alice, your head resting back against the chair, your feet moving slowly and without purpose between the fire and the ceiling and the window, where the rain drew its soft, irregular lines down the dark glass. There is a stage in an evening like this, an evening of quiet and warmth and firelight, where the mind begins to release its hold on the things it has been carrying through the day, the small and large concerns, the remembered and anticipated, the things done and undone, and yet to be done. And these things do not so much resolve as simply become less present, less weighted, as though the warmth of the room has softened them the way warmth softens wax, making them more yielding, more willing to be set aside for now. You had reached this stage without noticing you had reached it, and the noticing of it now was itself mild and pleasant. Another small, unhurried thought among many. What remained, when all of that had softened and receded, was something simpler, The chair and the blanket and the fire and the rain and the faint smell of wood smoke and the warmth in your hands. The small, satisfying sound of the cup on the saucer when you had set it down. The biscuit you had eaten slowly and the one you had decided not to eat. The candles burning lower, the fire burning lower, the evening itself burning lower, moving towards something that was not an ending, but was like an ending, a gradual fading of one thing into another thing that had no particular name. You thought about sleep again, in that same gradual and unhurried way. Your eyelids were heavier now, noticeably so in the comfortable and pleasant way of eyes that have been resting for a long time in a warm room. You did not fight this. There was nothing to fight. You simply sat with it, letting it be what it was, another element of the room and the evening. The heaviness of your eyes alongside the warmth of the fire and the sound of the rain, all of it simply there, simply present, making no demands. The castle around you was entirely still. You had not heard another sound from any other part of it since you had come down to this room. No footstep on a stair, no door, no voice. It was as though the whole building had settled into sleep already, all its rooms quiet and dark, its corridors empty, its staircase standing in its own old silence. Only this room was still inhabited, still lit, still warm, and you were the last waking thing in it, sitting in the chair by the dying fire with the rain outside the windows and the candles burning slowly down to their holders. You thought about tomorrow, and then you let the thought go, gently and without effort, the way you let a breath go, and it went, and there was no tomorrow in the room then, only this evening, only this hour, only this chair, and this fire, and this rain. Tomorrow was out there in the dark with the hills, patient and unhurried, and perfectly content to wait. The fire gave a small sound, a low and gentle settling, and you watched the coals shift almost imperceptibly in the grate, and then they were still again, burning just as before, but perhaps a fraction lower, a fraction dimmer. The light in the room had changed so gradually over the course of the evening that you had not consciously noticed each individual change. Only now, looking back at how the room had appeared when you first came in and comparing it to how it appeared now, could you perceive the difference, the room a little dimmer, a little more gathered into itself, the shadows a little more present in the corners and along the ceiling? You found this pleasing. The gradual dimming of a room is one of the gentle ways that time announces itself, not with any urgency, not with any particular message, simply as a soft and continuous change, the way seasons change, the way tides change imperceptibly, and then all at once. You shifted slightly in the chair again, a slow and minimal movement, adjusting your position by the smallest degree, and everything settled again, and you were still, and the room was still, and the sounds were still the same sounds, rain and fire, fire and rain, and they had been those sounds for so long now that they felt less like external things you were listening to, and more like conditions of the room itself, intrinsic to it, the way warmth was intrinsic, the way the smell of old stone was intrinsic, a long time past or perhaps a short time. It was difficult to say. Time in this room had lost its ordinary dimensions. It was not that it had slowed, but that it had ceased to be particularly meaningful. The way a piece of music ceases to be something you are waiting to end, and becomes instead simply what is happening, what has always been happening, what will go on happening, and you are simply within it, moving with it, or resting within it. There is no distinction. The candle on the left, the one with the imperfect wick, had melted a little faster than the other two, and now its height was noticeably less, its flame a little lower, giving off its light with slightly less intensity, but no less steadiness than before. You watched it for a while. It burned with complete consistency, never wavering, never changing, simply giving its light as it had been doing all evening, and would go on doing until there was nothing left to give. The thought occurred to you that you should perhaps go to bed, go up the stairs and along the corridor, and into your room, where the bed would be cool and the sheets would be crisp, and the window would show you the dark hills and the rain, if you looked. But then the thought passed without generating any particular impulse toward action, and you remained in the chair with the blanket across your lap and your head resting back against a high-cushioned back. And this seemed entirely right and appropriate, as though the chair and the room had made their claim on you for the evening, and you were content to honor it. The rain was very steady now, a sound you had ceased to hear as a sound, and had begun to hear simply as the ground of everything else, the way silence is the ground of sounds in a quiet room. But this was different from silence. This was the opposite of silence, and yet performed the same function, surrounding and containing and providing a kind of continuous soft texture against which the smaller sounds, the fire, the occasional distant wind, could be heard clearly and with pleasure. You closed your eyes, not with any intention of sleeping, or not primarily, simply because your eyes were very heavy, and closing them was a very natural and pleasant thing to do. And when you closed them, the sounds became immediately more present, the fire and the rain filling the darkness behind your eyelids with a warmth that was almost physical, a warmth made of sound that settled over you the way the blanket settled over your legs. In the dark behind your closed eyes there were slow movements of light, the fire's light moving through your eyelids in a very dim and gentle way, barely perceptible. Not quite darkness and not quite light, but something intermediate, a soft, warm, reddish darkness that pulsed very slowly in time with the breathing of the fire. You did not think about this. You simply experienced it, passively and without any particular attention, the way you experience the texture of a surface under your hand without consciously deciding to notice it. Your breathing had slowed during the time you had been sitting here. You were not aware of this as something you had done, but only as something that had happened, as natural and unconscious as the other changes that had come over you during the evening, the heaviness in your eyes and the warmth in your hands and the softening of all the things the day had carried. Your breath came in slowly and went out slowly, and the interval between them was perhaps a little longer than usual, a little more spacious, a little more content with its own pace. The chair held you very comfortably. This was the kind of chair that had been designed for exactly this purpose, for sitting in by firelight in old rooms on rainy evenings, deep and well cushioned and with arms at exactly the right height, and it had been doing this for a very long time, holding the bodies of guests and inhabitants through many evenings very much like this one, and it knew how to do it. It had the accumulated knowledge of all those evenings in its fabric and its frame, and it held you now with a kind of practiced and unpretentious ease. You let your mind wander where it wanted to go, which was not very far in any direction. It moved among the sounds and sensations of the room, settled briefly on the image of the hills as you had seen them from your window in the afternoon, moved to the color of the fire's coals, returned to the sound of the rain. These were not thoughts exactly, or not thoughts in the way thoughts usually feel, with their edges and their purposes and their implied next steps. They were more like the fragments of thoughts the material thoughts are made of before they are assembled into anything particular, drifting and reforming and drifting again, without any need to arrive anywhere. The fire settled again. You did not open your eyes. You heard the small sound it made, that low settling breath, and felt in your body the very slight change in the warmth on your face as the fire adjusted itself, a tiny lessening of heat that you would not have noticed at any other time, but that in the quiet and stillness of this moment was entirely perceptible, a small fluctuation in the warmth that was itself a kind of information, a gentle communication from the fire about its own condition, its own slow progress through the evening. You thought, slowly and without urgency, about the word cozy. It was a word that had always seemed to you slightly insufficient for what it was trying to describe, too small a word for the particular combination of warmth and enclosure and quiet that it was meant to indicate. But sitting here now, in this chair, in this room, in this castle, with the fire and the rain and the candles and the blanket, you thought that perhaps the word was exactly right after all, that what it described was precisely this, nothing more dramatic or elaborate than this, simply the feeling of being warm and enclosed and quiet, while the weather goes about its business outside. Simply this which was sufficient, which was more than sufficient, which was in this moment everything. Your head was heavy against the back of the chair. Your eyes remained closed, and there was no particular reason to open them. The room was all around you, warm and dimly lit and full of its quiet sounds, and you were in it, and it was in you. And between the two of you there was a perfect and uncomplicated agreement about this evening and its purpose and its pace. The rain went on falling, and the fire went on breathing, and somewhere above the castle the wind moved through the dark air and then settled again, and the candles went on burning with their steady, patient light, and the old stone walls held all of it. The warmth and the light and the sound and the particular quality of this hour held it as they had held so many hours before this one, quietly and without effort, the way they had always done. Time had become very soft. It was not moving slowly, exactly, though it felt that way. It was more that its movement had become so smooth and even that it had ceased to be perceptible as movement at all, ceased to be something you could feel the passage of. It was like being in a boat on very still water, where the motion is real and continuous, but so gentle and so constant, that after you simply exist in it without awareness of it as motion, aware only of the water and the light and the sound of small waves against the hull. The warmth of the room was very even now, very settled. The fire had burned down to a steady, even glow, not bright but not dark, simply warm, and the candles were lower, their light perhaps a little softer, and all of these things together made the room feel as though it had arrived at something, as though the evening had reached its own natural level, its own right temperature and light, and was content to remain there, to go on being exactly what it was for as long as needed. You breathed in. The air was warm and slightly smoky and faintly mineral and faintly herbal, a complex and gentle smell that contained the whole of the room within it. You breathed out. The chair was very comfortable. The blanket was very warm. The sounds were very calm. You did not think about whether you were going to sleep. The question had ceased to be relevant. You were here, and the room was here, and everything was as it should be, and that was the whole of it, the beginning and the end of it, the sum of everything that needed to be true about this evening. The fire breathed, the rain fell, the candles burned. You were warm and still and very quiet, and the night was all around you, and the hills were in the dark outside, patient and enormous, and entirely indifferent to anything but their own long existence. And the rain was falling on them as it had always fallen, and the castle stood in the rain as it had always stood, and the room held its warmth and its light, and you were in the room, and this was all there was, and it was enough, it was entirely enough, it was everything. The sound of the rain shifted very slightly, settling into itself the way sounds do in the deep of the night, when everything that was going to change for the evening has changed, and what remains is simply what is, steady and complete, and without any remaining ambition toward variation. It was a full sound now, a sound that filled the room evenly the way water fills a vessel, from the bottom up, until the room was full of it, full of rain sound and fire sound, and the very faint low sound of the candle flames in their holders, all of it together making something that was not quite music and not quite silence, but was perhaps the best of both, the steadiness of silence and the presence of music. You did not move. There was no reason to move. The chair had everything you needed, and the room had everything the chair needed, and the night had everything the room needed, and all of it fit together without any remainder, without anything left over that needed attending to. Your breathing was very slow. Each breath took its time, going in without hurry and coming out without hurry, and between each breath there was a small rest, a small interval of absolute stillness, in which everything was very quiet, in which even the sounds of the room seemed to pause for a fraction of a moment before resuming, though of course they did not pause. They went on continuously. It was only the quality of your attention that changed in those intervals, becoming for a moment so inward and so still that the outward sounds seemed temporarily more distant. The fire was very low now, not out, not close to being out, but low, burning with a steady, patient intensity that was more warmth than light, more presence than display. The coals were deep amber, almost brown at the edges, and they gave off their heat quietly, and without any drama, the way very old and practiced things give off what they have to give, simply and without waste. A long time passed. You were aware of it only in the way you are aware of a season changing, not as a sequence of perceptible moments, but as a condition that is simply different when you finally attend to it than it was when you last attended to it. The room was the same. The sounds were the same. Everything was the same, and yet the evening had moved through its own deep and quiet degrees, had aged itself another increment, had moved a little further into that territory of late night that has its own particular quality, its own particular weight and stillness. You thought very gently and without any urgency that you were nearly asleep. The thought was mild and pleasant, observational rather than directive, simply a note about where you were, like noting that you are nearly at the end of a long, quiet road, the destination just ahead, and no reason to hurry toward it, since arriving and not yet arriving are both, in their own ways, perfectly fine. The candle on the left had burned almost to its holder. Its light was very small now, a small steady flame above a very small remaining column of wax, and it gave its light without any diminishment of steadiness, burning exactly as it had burned all evening, simply with less of itself left to burn. And there was something in this that you found very peaceful. The faithfulness of it, the consistency, the way it went on being what it was for as long as it could. The rain on the windows was very soft now, or perhaps you had simply become very accustomed to it, had incorporated it so completely into your awareness that it no longer had the quality of a sound. You were hearing and had become instead simply part of the texture of the room, part of the fabric of the evening, the way familiar sounds become in familiar places, present and real, but no longer requiring attention. The hills were out there in the dark. You did not need to see them to know this. They were there as they had always been, large and quiet and dark and wet, the rain falling on them with the same even patience with which it was falling on the windows of this room, and they received it without comment, as they received all weather stoically, and without preference, existing in the rain as they existed in the sun, simply existing the way very old things exist, without needing anything to be different from what it is. Their eyes were closed, or they were open. It did not seem to make very much difference. The room was the same either way, warm and dim and quiet, the fire breathing very slowly, the rain falling, the candles near the end of their burning. Everything was very near the end of something, or rather everything was in that long, quiet approach to an ending that is in some ways more peaceful than the ending itself, because in that approach there is still the ongoing, still the continuous, still the steady, unchanged presence of all these things that have been with you through the evening. You were warm. You were comfortable. You were very still. The sounds of the room were the sounds of the room, and they had been those sounds all evening, and they would go on being those sounds, the fire and the rain and the faint intermittent wind, and they would go on whether you were listening to them or not, whether you were awake or asleep, whether this evening ended or went on forever, which it felt in some gentle and imprecise way as though it might. The chair held you. The blanket held you. The room held you. The castle held the room. The hills held the castle. The dark and the rain held the hills. And all of it together made something so large and so quiet and so entirely without urgency that being inside it, being part of it, being held by it, was perhaps the nearest thing to rest that the evening had to offer. The fire breathed in. The fire breathed out. The rain fell. You were here, and the night was here, and the warmth was here, and none of it required anything of you, not even attention, not even wakefulness, nothing at all except this, simply this, your presence in the room and the room's presence around you, each of you simply being what you were in the quiet and the warmth, and the gentle and continuous sound of rain. Somewhere in the hills, far away and invisible, a small stream moved over its stones in the dark, carrying the rain down toward the loch, and the loch received it without disturbance, adding it quietly to itself, and the rain went on falling into the loch, and the stream went on carrying its water down, and the hills sat in the dark with the rain on them. And all of this was simply happening, as it had always been happening, as it would always be happening, gentle and continuous and without end. The candle on the left went out. There was no drama in this. The flame simply ceased to be there, and the small smell of extinguished candle drifted very briefly through the room and then was gone, and the room was a little dimmer for the absence of it, a little more settled into its own dimness, and this was entirely right, entirely as it should be, one more small and gentle change in an evening that had been made entirely of small and gentle changes. The other 2 candles went on burning. The fire went on glowing, the rain went on falling. The walls went on holding their centuries of quiet, and you went on sitting in the chair, or perhaps you were no longer quite sitting. Perhaps you had drifted in your chair, settled deeper into it, your head resting more fully against the cushioned back, your hands slack in your lap, your breathing so slow, and even that it was barely distinguishable from stillness. There was nothing left to do. There was nothing left to attend to. There was only the warmth and the sounds and the dim and gentle light, and all of these things were very far away now, or not far away, but soft, soft, as though they were being perceived through several layers of something fine and gauzy, something that allowed them to pass through, but gently reduced them, gently made them less insistent. The fire breathed. The rain fell. The night held everything in its large and patient arms. And you were in the night, and the night was in you, and there was nothing between you. No distance, no distinction. Only this long and quiet and unhurried evening, drifting softly and without any destination through the hours, carrying you with it, gently, gently like water, carrying something very light on its surface, bearing it along without effort, without intention, simply by being what it is, moving as it has always moved toward wherever it is going, which is nowhere in particular, which is simply forward, which is simply onward, which is simply the next quiet moment, and then the next, and then the next, each one the same as the last, each one warm and dark and full of the sound of rain. The fire breathed. The rain fell. The night continued, patient and unhurried, doing what nights do, which is simply to hold things, to hold the warmth, and the dark, and the sound of weather, and the old stone walls, and the dimming candles, and the deep quiet, chairs and everything in them, all of it held in the night's large and gentle keeping, nothing lost, nothing urgent, everything simply here, simply present, simply continuing in the way that all things continue that have found their pace and their place in their own particular kind of rest. Breathe in, breathe out. The rain, the fire, the dark, the warmth, this room, this night, this stillness, simply this. There is a particular kind of darkness that comes in the highlands after the last light has left the sky, a darkness that is not harsh or cold, but has a depth to it, a density, as though it were made of something more substantial than the mere absence of light. You have felt this darkness before in other places and on other nights, but here it has its own quality, something to do with the hills and the age of the stone and the way the rain softens everything, brings everything closer together, makes the darkness and the warmth and the sound into a single continuous thing rather than separate elements that happen to occupy the same space. The sitting room had not changed. This was one of its most important qualities, the quality you had perhaps appreciated most deeply all evening without ever quite putting a name to it. The room did not change. The fire changed, slowly and inevitably, burning lower by degrees too small to track consciously, and the candles changed, consuming themselves with the same quiet patience, and the rain outside changed in the way rain always changes. varying its intensity by small fractions without ever entirely altering its fundamental character. But the room itself, the walls and the floor and the old rug, and the deep chairs and the tapestries and the writing desk with its glass paperweight catching the last of the candlelight, these did not change. They had not changed for a very long time, and they would not change tonight, and this permanence, this gentle immovability, was perhaps the thing that made it possible to rest here in the way you were resting, to let everything else soften and recede and slow. You thought, briefly, about the people who had sat in this room before you, not with any particular curiosity about who they had been or what their lives had contained, but simply with an awareness of their having been here, having sat in chairs very much like this one, having looked at a fire very much like this one, having listened to rain very much like this. They were long gone, most of them, returned to the earth that the hills were made of, and yet something of their evenings remained, not in any specific or attributable way, but in the general quality of the room itself, in the way it knew how to hold an evening like this, in the ease and completeness with which it contained warmth and quiet, and the particular kind of rest that comes to people who have found their way to a right place at a right time. You were one of those people tonight. You had found your way here, to this chair, to this fire, to this rain, and the room received you as it had received all the others, without distinction or preference, simply as another person on another evening in need of the same simple things: warmth, enclosure, the soft sound of weather, the unhurried company of a dying fire. The second candle was lower now. You could see this without paying it any particular attention, the way you can see many things in a room you have been sitting in for a long time, simply because they are in your field of vision and your eyes move across them naturally as you breathe and exist. It had perhaps an inch remaining, perhaps a little more, and it would go on burning for some time yet, burning with the same faithfulness as before, neither hurrying nor slowing, simply continuing. The fire's coals were very deep now, very settled. They had moved beyond the orange-amber stage into something closer to a dark, glowing red, the kind of color that suggests heat more than light, a color that is felt as much as seen. The warmth they gave off had not diminished much. Coals hold heat long after the visible flame is gone, and these coals were still doing their patient work, radiating steadily into the room. When you held your hand palm outward toward the fireplace, you could feel the warmth on your skin, a mild and pleasant warmth, and then you lowered your hand back to your lap, and the warmth from your palm mingled with the warmth of the blanket, and both of them together were very comfortable. Outside, the rain continued. You had lost any ability to estimate how long it had been falling, or how long you had been sitting here, and this loss felt not like a lack, but like a kind of freedom, a release from the ordinary obligation of tracking time that you carried through most days without thinking about it. Here, time had become a purely internal thing, measured only by the small changes in the room, the burning down of candles and coals, the deepening of the hour, and even these were not so much measurements as observations, noted without any particular significance. The highland rain has a sound distinct from rain in other places, or at least it seems so from inside a room like this, where the walls are thick and the windows are deep set, and the stone absorbs some of the sound before transmitting it inward. It comes through slightly softened, slightly transformed, as though it has traveled a distance before reaching you, though of course it is only inches away on the other side of the glass. But those inches of glass and the inches of stone on either side of the window create a particular quality, a particular remove that makes the rain sound both very present and very outside, very much part of the world beyond the room, while also being an intimate and familiar part of the room's own atmosphere. You thought about the stone of the walls, about its age and its thickness, about the way it had been cut and placed by hands you would never know long ago, in a landscape that had looked much as it looked today. Stone does not change very much, or rather it changes so slowly that within a human scale of time it is effectively permanent. The same stone that had been cut and placed all those centuries ago was still here, still in its place, still doing what it had been placed to do, and within it the same moisture and the same mineral compounds that had always been there, the same faint smell of cold and age that you could detect beneath the warmth of the fire if you breathed in carefully, an ancient and entirely inoffensive smell, the smell of time-made material. You breathed in carefully. Yes, there it was, cool and faintly mineral, present beneath the wood smoke and the candle wax and the lavender of the blanket, the smell of the stone itself, the foundational smell of the room. It was not unpleasant. It was, if anything, reassuring the way very old things can be reassuring simply by being very old, simply by having been here through so many changes and having remained, simply by demonstrating by their continued existence that continuity is possible, that some things persist. The wind came again, that distant and intermittent sound somewhere high above, and some gap or passage between the old stones of the upper towers, and it moved through whatever space it occupied, and then went silent again, as it had done all evening, and the rain went on beneath the space it had left, filling the silence with its own steady voice. You thought about the lock. You had seen it from the road, or what you believed was it, a long narrow expanse of dark water lying in the valley between two ranges of hills, perfectly still in the light rain, its surface the color of pewter or old silver, reflecting a sky that was already moving toward gray. Lochs in the highlands have a quality of stillness that is different from the stillness of other bodies of water, something to do with the hills surrounding them and the way the hills seem to lean in toward the water, the way the landscape seems to gather and concentrate around them. Standing water in a landscape like this is always a kind of mirror, reflecting the hills and the sky back at themselves, and there is something deeply calming about that, about a body of water that shows the world its own image, quietly and without comment. The loch was out there now, in the dark and the rain, doing what lochs do in the dark and the rain, which is simply to exist, to be still and deep and dark and patient, to receive the rain without ripple or protest, to hold the darkness on its surface as it has always held everything that comes to it, without preference or resistance. You did not need to see it to know this. It was enough to know that it was there, part of the dark landscape that surrounded the castle, and the room and the fire and the chair, and you, all of it out there in the wet and the dark, existing in its own quiet way. The tea had been finished for some time now. The tray on the low table held the empty pot and the empty cup on its saucer and the plate with the one remaining biscuit, and all of these things had settled into the table as though they had always been there, as though they were simply part of the furniture of this hour, objects that had found their place. The biscuit remained on its plate, and you were glad it was there, glad in a mild and entirely uncomplicated way. The gladness you feel for a small and quietly pleasing thing that requires nothing of you. The chair breathed with you, or you breathed with the chair, or perhaps it was the room that breathed slowly in and slowly out, the fire contracting and expanding by the smallest degree with each shift of air, the candles holding steady, the whole enclosed space making its very gentle accommodation to your continued presence within it, as it had been doing all evening without your needing to notice. Your thoughts had become very slow. They moved like things in deep water, with that same heavy and deliberate pace, and they did not so much arrive as drift into view, and then drift away again, not replaced by other thoughts, but simply by a mild and pleasant vacancy, a space between thoughts in which there was nothing but the warmth and the sounds, and the dim light and the pleasant weight of your own body in the chair. This was, you thought, or almost thought, or experienced as something in the vicinity of a thought. This was what it meant to rest. Not the cessation of activity, because you had been effectively inactive for a long time now. Not the absence of awareness, because you were still aware, still present to the room and its qualities, still hearing the rain and feeling the warmth, and occasionally noting the small changes in the fire and the candles. But something that went underneath all of that, something more fundamental, a letting down of whatever it was in you that ordinarily maintained a kind of readiness, a tension too habitual to be felt until it was released. And its release was this, exactly this, the body settling fully into the chair, and the chair accepting it fully, and the room accepting both of them, and the night accepting the room and the hills, accepting the night and all of it together, making something seamless and quiet and without any remaining seam or edge or place where one thing ended and another began. The rain was the hills, and the hills were the dark, and the dark was the room, and the room was the fire. The fire was the warmth, and the warmth was you, and you were the chair, and the chair was the room, and the room was the rain. These were not thoughts, exactly. They were more like a gradual dissolution of the boundaries between one perception and another, the way a landscape becomes less distinct in mist, the edges of things softening and blending until you can no longer say precisely where the hill ends and the sky begins, and this is not distressing, but is instead a kind of relief, a release from the ordinary demand of distinct and separate things. The second candle on the mantelpiece was growing very small. You could see this with your eyes, which had opened at some point or perhaps had not fully closed, and what they saw was the candle, the small and faithful flame above its last remaining wax, burning as it had always burned, steady and complete. It would go out soon, as the first candle had gone out, quietly and without drama, and then there would be one candle and the fire, and then only the fire, and then only the coals, and through all of these stages the room would remain the room, and the evening would remain the evening, and the rain would remain the rain. There was nothing to hurry toward and nothing to leave behind. There was only this sequence of small and gentle diminishments, each one a natural and inevitable development of the ones before it. The evening doing what evenings do, which is simply to end, or not quite end, but to arrive at the place where ending and continuing become the same thing, where there is no longer any distinction between going to sleep and simply being in the room, being warm, being here. The fire breathed. The rain went on. The hills were in the dark. The lock was in the dark. The road was in the dark, winding through the pine trees. Empty now, no headlights, no movement, simply the road and the rain and the dark and the hills on either side. The whole of the highlands was asleep, lying in the dark under the rain with the patience of very old and unhurried things, and the castle was in the middle of it all, warm and still. The fire breathed very slowly now. The coals had deepened to an inner glow, more warmth than light, and the room held this warmth thoroughly and evenly, releasing it gradually through the night. A long, slow exhalation. Breathe in, breathe out, the rain, the warmth, the dark, the chair, the blanket. Everything in its place, everything quiet, everything patient. Simply this, the rain, the warmth, the long and gentle sound of an evening settling into its own stillness, becoming indistinguishable from the night itself, which is itself indistinguishable from rest. Simply this,